We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make Cap Times Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey and Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Epic. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.
Hi, I'm Chris Murphy, Managing Editor of the Cap Times, and I'd like to welcome you to Cap Times Idea Fest 2021, featuring both live and virtual sessions. Our theme this year is Reckoning with Change, and there's certainly been a lot of that. Between the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the election, there's a lot to talk about this year. Staging Idea Fest is always a big lift, and we couldn't do it without Cap Times members. If you're not already, I hope you'll consider becoming one. Not only do members help shape events like this one, but they support an independent and trustworthy local media source at a critical time. Find details online at membership.captimes.com. Finally, I'd like to thank the Burrish Group at UBS, which is the presenting sponsor of Idea Fest this year, as well as our numerous other sponsors. So please, enjoy this session. You'll find other festival videos and information too at captimesideafest.com.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Andrew Marinis, and I am a Director of Special Projects at the Vanderbilt University Athletic Department. And as part of that, I manage the Sports and Society initiative here at Vanderbilt. And I also write books on sports and social justice for teenagers. And I'm just wrapping up the manuscript for a book that'll come out next year on the 50th anniversary of Title IX on the first U.S. women's Olympic basketball team, which played at the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. And so Title IX and that period of women's sports has been on my mind a lot over the last year as I've been working on the book. And so I'm really honored to have four incredible women and scholars here to talk about Title IX, both the incredible changes that have occurred in women's sports over these last 50 years, but also significantly the unfinished business that still remains in achieving equity with women's sports, and also some of the unintended or were they unintended consequences of Title IX, and just the landscape that we see in women's sports and compared to men's sports in this country. I also want to say a special thank you to the Capital Times for including all of us in this presentation. Madison, Wisconsin means a lot to me. I was born there. My grandfather was the editor of the Capital Times, and so I grew up hearing a lot about this newspaper and coming back to Madison every summer to visit. And so it's a real honor for me to be included in an event that's hosted by that paper in that great city. So let's get on with the introductions of our speakers. I'll do this in alphabetical order. So first we have my good friend Simone Charlie. Simone is wrapping up her second year with the Portland Thorns. She's a professional soccer player out in Oregon right now. She's also played professionally in Australia. And here at Vanderbilt, Simone was an incredible student, academic All-SEC, as well as athletically All-SEC, graduated with a double major in psychology and sociology. And while she was playing soccer and running track, she also earned a master's in medicine, health, and society. She also competed in the Olympic trials in the triple jump. So Simone is just an incredible person, student, and athlete. And Simone, thank you for making time to be with us today. Also in the state of Oregon, we have Courtney Cox, who's at the University of Oregon. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies at Oregon, also the co-director of The Sound of Victory. And I encourage everybody to check out the clips that she has on her website on this amazing project, what she says is a multi-platform project located at the intersection of music and sport. Her work focuses on labor, identity, and technology through sport. And before her academic career, and I was really interested in this, Courtney, you worked for ESPN with the Longhorn Network, for an NPR affiliate in Pasadena, California, and for the Los Angeles Sparks of the WNBA. So what an interesting career you've had, and look forward to hearing so much more about it. Next, we have Victoria Jackson out at Arizona State, so staying in Pac-12 country with Courtney, where Victoria is a sports historian and clinical assistant professor of history. She writes about the intersection of sports and society, and I love reading her work. You may have seen it in the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Slate, The Independent, and The Athletic, among many other publications, or even have seen her on 60 Minutes. And that was so much fun, Victoria, to see you on that iconic show recently. And Victoria was also a student athlete in college, in track and field, and also a professional athlete. So Victoria, thank you for joining us today. And then finally here in Nashville, I'm at Vanderbilt in Nashville, and just about a mile away is Christy Oshiro, who's an assistant professor of sports administration at Belmont University, just down the road. She earned her PhD in kinesiology from Texas A&M, and a master's in kinesiology and her bachelor's from East Carolina, where she also was a student athlete, a softball player. Is that right, Christy? So she has, again, that experience as an athlete, as academic. Her work focuses on the intersection of race and gender, as well as sports marketing and the utility of new media in sports spaces. So thank you to these four amazing panelists for being with us today. And, I've gone over these brief introductions, but I wanted to give you all a chance just to give the audience a sense of who you are, to tell us a little bit more about the work that you're interested in, the issues that you're following these days, as well as a formative moment in your youth related to sports, whether that was a moment that got you interested in playing, or a moment that showed you that there was more to sports than just the playing. It was something that you could study and write about in life as well. And Simone, we'll get started with you.
Hey guys. Yeah, so I would say sports have been a part of my life for basically as long as I can remember. I started playing soccer in kindergarten, and I started running track in first grade. But I would say, as far as like when I started thinking deeper about sports and like the meaning behind it, and especially the intersection of gender in sport, I would say more so probably in college. I took a race, gender, and sport class, and I feel like for the longest time when it comes to sports, I never really thought deeply about the meaning behind it, especially being a woman in sports. And so I feel like for me, that class kind of opened my eyes to just the meaning behind that. But I think for me, becoming a professional athlete, that's when I've kind of come head to head with what it means to be a female athlete, just with the things that we have to endure and like the lives that we live compared to our male counterparts. I think for me has been eye-opening as far as what it means to be a female athlete and how far we still have to go.
Well, that's great, Simone. I want to ask you some more questions about that as we get into the conversation. So, Courtney, how about you?
I feel like I'm the least athletic person on this panel. I feel like woefully out of my depth in that way, for sure. For me, I have a very similar, I feel like sport was this very early connection for me that created community. It was like versus hanging out with your friends and orange slices for sure. But I think there's something that kind of hooked me early on. I had a very early experience of my dad being my coach, which is something I do not recommend because my dad's very competitive. And so I think I learned a lot early on. And my parents put me in a lot of different sports, figure skating, soccer, volleyball, track. And so I think it was about like this idea of well-roundedness at first. And I think realizing I was peaking athletically around middle school, I realized I still wanted sport to be a part of my life. And so I wasn't sure what that meant. I was an athletic trainer in high school. I thought I was going to rehab athletes for a living. And then I got into journalism in undergrad, and sports journalism and sports media was just it for me. And so I think for me, as someone that knew that I wasn't going to be on the court, on the pitch, I knew that there was something about sport that allowed me to ask a lot of questions. And some of those questions were about who's allowed to play, and what are the parameters that decide what sport looks like, what sport is valuable. And so I think there are all these moments that we have where sport gives us this intense feeling, one way or the other. We love something, we hate something. And I just find in my work and even in the classroom, it's this way we can have these conversations that otherwise might feel uncomfortable, otherwise might cause us to question if we were outside of what we might know, right? There's something we know about sport that allows us to have these conversations about race or gender, nationality, belonging broadly, that I really, really love.
Oh, that's terrific. And how about you, Victoria?
Oh, well, speaking about my kind of personal relationship with sport and athletics, I grew up a kid who loved just playing outside and moving, and what that kind of transformed into was running free. So lots of unstructured pickup games like football, mixed gender, not realizing that was the thing. It was just like the kids who were playing. And then I went to summer camp in the North Woods of Wisconsin, and have to shout out Wisconsin for being a formative part of my development, where, it was an all girls camp and we just played all the water sports. And I found snowmobile trails and got special permission to leave campgrounds as like a middle schooler, and would just go on these long, epic runs through the woods all by myself. And the experience of that I've carried with me and realized I need in my life, this sense of kind of power and feeling my body move for me and using my body for my own pleasure is something that I took for granted as a kid, and now see both in my work and also just in personal experiences as life goes on, something that's incredibly powerful and can be useful in so many ways. And it also doesn't need to be useful. That's what's so great about it too. It's this thing that can serve us when it needs to, and it's just there for us always. As far as realizing I could study academically sport, I'm a product of amateurism. I joke that I drank the amateur Kool-Aid, and that, when I played sports, I was playing sports and focused and 100% all in with that. And then when I was academic and scholarly, I was studying history. And it seems kind of silly to not realize that I could be using sport to study the things that I was studying around race and gender and education and US history. It's like a no-brainer. But I think when you grow up in sports systems, you are very good at being 100% all in. And you're the most coachable people on the planet, because you're part of a project to be the best that you and your team can be. And so it was only when I turned professional and was running outside the US and seeing how incredibly popular, surprisingly, the sport of track and field is in places like Europe, and culturally and socially and politically and economically. And then, of course, as someone who is studying educational disparities in the US, talk about a technicolor illustration of that when we're talking about college sports. And so after I was done competing professionally, returned to graduate school to use sport as a window into these systems of power and privilege that are everywhere in US society, but we can see them, as Courtney was saying, oftentimes most explicitly in sporting spaces.
Terrific. Okay, and Christy, what were your formative experiences, and how did you learn, that sports was something that you could study?
Sure. Oh my goodness, so many amazing stories already. Like Andrew, I have so many questions that I'm just itching to ask and learn more about. I want to start by saying that I was born and raised in Mililani, Hawaii, and use that as an opportunity to say proudly, kind of a shout out and pay homage to Patsy Mink, who was, just pivotal in pushing for Title IX. And maybe we wouldn't be here today having this great panel if it wasn't for those efforts during that time. And so sport has always been a huge part of my life. I like to tell this story. It's quite funny. I'm named after Christy Yamaguchi, figure skater, and my parents just loved her beauty and her grace on the ice and how she carried herself. And so they named me after her. Go figure, I wound up playing softball and love being in the dirt and all that stuff. And I'm not very graceful in my day-to-day life. But needless to say, sport has always been a huge thing. A formative experience for me took place in college. And I like to say that my highest highs and my lowest lows really came during my time as a college athlete at East Carolina. And kind of the long story short here is that my sophomore year, our team underwent an NCAA investigation, which resulted in a coaching change, which if you watch women's sport or are in tune with it, is not very uncommon, right? It tends to happen, unfortunately. And so as a young woman at the time who was working through the struggles of, verbal abuse or just reasonable expectations on the field, while also off the field, just trying to navigate life as a Japanese American woman in the South, for the first time was just so much to handle. And it definitely came with its challenges. However, at the same time, I would be remiss not to acknowledge that I received incredible support and resources in other facets of life because of my time as a college athlete. And so while it was really difficult, I don't shy away from the fact in saying that I benefited largely from that system, in that it provided me with these opportunities and it opened doors for me that, I probably wouldn't have had otherwise, which absolutely propelled me into the place where I am today. And so it's those personal experiences that largely inform how I see sport, how I study sport, because I'm kind of, you're aware of the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? How good it can be when it works well, the shortcomings, the needs to address it, and everything in between. So my research generally focuses now on diversity, equity, and inclusion in sport, specifically on the intersection of race and gender. But I've done a lot of work looking at illuminating the lived experiences of former female college athletes of color, in terms of how can we take their stories and use it to enhance current and future student athletes' lives in terms of navigational strategies and so many other things. And so it was really personal experience and stories from my teammates, my colleagues, and other women in the sporting space that has informed kind of my view of sport and where I am today.
Well, I wish we had all day to talk, with the personal and professional experiences that each of you have. I think we could have a full day's conversation, but to get the Q&A started, Victoria, I'll start with you. And I think we've all been on these Zooms where someone will throw out the question and try to be polite and not name someone to answer. And people are forced to say, oh, who wants to take it? So I'm going to address these to a specific person, but then everyone feel free to follow up on that. But Christy mentioned Patsy Mink, and I can't believe we have a panelist young enough to be named after Christy Yamaguchi also. But when we think back to before Title IX, and I think that we're going to have people watching this that are young women involved in sports right now who have grown up in a post-Title IX world who may not understand what the landscape looked like before Title IX. Victoria, can you kind of set the stage of what sports for women looked like in this country in the 1950s, 60s, early 70s, leading up to the passage of Title IX in 1972?
Absolutely. I think the place to start is with Title VIII. Ed Temple. Ed Temple and with folks with Tennessee connections. Ed Temple was a longtime head coach at Tennessee State. And he, I lead with Ed Temple because I'm right now leading with historically Black colleges. And the sporting experiences for women at HBCUs before Title IX were best in world. They were subsidized educational opportunities for women who often were from the Jim Crow South and wouldn't have been able to pay for or attend college otherwise. And Ed Temple and other coaches at other colleges as well recruited young women to give them, this door opening opportunity. And these women then went on to make up Team USA in track and field. Wilma Rudolph and Naomi Osaka are the two most recognized athlete from the many who came through colleges like Tennessee State. If we're looking at predominantly white institutions, the colleges that make up the power universities of the Power Five today, the sporting opportunities for women at those schools were run by women for women and women's PE. The thing that Title IX did that I think I understand to be revolutionary at the K through 12 level is that it desegregated physical education by gender. We often talk about the elite sporting opportunities that were enhanced and protected for girls and women in school sports, but PE becoming desegregated by gender is where you get boys and girls playing together and learning from each other. And I think that's really where the radical potential of Title IX in a sporting sense really stood. And so what happened at PWIs after the passage of Title IX is, first of all, we already had women competing in college sports in the AIAW, the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. And the AIAW launched before Title IX. So again, there were women who weren't paid as athletic directors or coaches, but who were faculty in PE, who had students, some of whom were PE majors, some were not. They just liked to play sports, and they craved interscholastic competition. They wanted to compete. They wanted elite sporting experiences. And so, my history PhD dissertation looks at how this all played out at the local level on the ground to tell a national story of how these sporting opportunities were created and then what happened after the passage of Title IX. And, I use UNC Chapel Hill as my local campus to tell this story. And UNC is a place that has many colleges in close proximity. And so, you all jump in the station wagon and drive over to Duke. And then, Elon happens to be there too, in Appalachian State. And they've driven for the last 4 hours and they fall out of their car and, okay, we're all going to play now. But, we're going to play against each other. It's not going to be this play day model where we all come together and we don't keep score and then we have cookies and lemonade afterwards. There were women who wanted elite competitive experiences. And so that's the kind of grassroots, local and regional origin of what inevitably grew into national competition in the AIAW, run by women who often had kids at home, who had advising obligations, teaching obligations, and then also stayed to referee a game at no additional pay because they cared so much about giving young women sporting opportunities. So that's the landscape in 1971.
All right. Thank you. And Christy, you mentioned Patsy Mink. And so I think it would be important for us to talk about Title IX's significance as a piece of legislation, and at the time, it was right around the same time as ERA, and Sally Jenkins said that Title IX is the real Equal Rights Amendment because it passed, right? And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about Patsy Mink and the legislative effort that went into this, why it was important to her, why we should remember her, and Edith Green, Birch Bayh, Bunny Sandler, had filed the lawsuit against every United States university. What was happening legislatively to make this possible? And here are the heroes of this story.
Oh, that's a big question to answer.
Answer any part of it.
Start by addressing and just saying that, even though these things are things that we celebrate now, it certainly was not without resistance And I was reading a book here lately that talked about how resistance over time and why that matters. And how sometimes in the moment, it doesn't seem like all the goals are met, but it's those sentiments that are reverberated over time that really make an impact on larger society. And I think that all of those efforts led by Patsy Mink and others are one of those big things that have big impacts over time. Goodness, it's hard to put into words what it means and how to address that. I think in terms of participation and access is one thing that it hugely opened up doors, but now what we're grappling with is treatment, right? Now that we've been granted these opportunities and that participation has increased across the board, now how are we treating these individuals, these women in sport when they're in there? Are we valuing them? Are we investing in them? What does that look like? And so when Victoria mentioned kind of pre-Title IX and what that looked like, leading with the HBCUs, I really appreciate hearing that because it reminded me, and I shared this with Andrew earlier in emails, that a couple years ago, the 45th anniversary actually of Title IX, I attended a panel on Title IX, and it was called Title IX at 45. And it was at my predominantly white institution that I attended. And then later that week, I want to pull it up to get it straight, I had the opportunity to attend a similar panel at an HBCU right down the road. The title of that was Reclaiming My Nine, Examining the State of Fair Play, Title IX, and Women of Color in Sport. And they offered incredible content, but very different sentiments, which I think is important when looking at not only where we've been, but how far we've come. And in celebrating those small victories, but staying true to the objectives that the founders had created in the first place.
And that leads right into the next question for Courtney, talking about treatment. So I think any discussion of the 50th anniversary of Title IX will involve the theme of unfinished business. You know, Courtney, we saw quite a bit of social media and water cooler discussion about the inequities between the men's and women's NCAA basketball tournaments this past spring. There recently was the Kaplan report that was, inspired by that inequity, looking at the NCAA and how it treats those two tournaments and those sports. And some of our audience is probably very familiar with what we're talking about. Others maybe not so much. Could you sort of set the stage and what was seen in the disparities between those two tournaments, and then a little bit about what the Kaplan report findings were?
Absolutely. So one of the things that, I was just thinking as I was listening to both Victoria and also Christy about like what this means in terms of enacting law versus in practice, what these things look like, right? So how folks are treated, how they're compensated, how they're taken care of, how they're rehabilitated, right? To go back to my athletic trainer history, right? All these things really matter. And we keep having stories that are either about the lack of resources or abusive behavior in sport, right? Across the board. And so one of the things I think about is Title IX as this very unstable category, right? And so thinking about it being a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a starting place of thinking broadly about educational equity, I think is important, because I think even when I teach Title IX, students are just thinking about it through sport, right? Versus like how we move, going back to Victoria, how we move through society, how US society works in general. And so thinking about it for me as this we're constantly fighting for Title IX, right? It's this thing that we will celebrate for the next 12 months, but it is unstable in terms of how the Civil Rights Restoration Act is going on in the 80s. And so thinking about last year, right? Thinking about the ways that we are still fighting with the Department of Education for Title IX, how Title IX itself is something that is always fought for. And so I think that as I'm watching how trans athletes, non-binary athletes are treated under Title IX, how Title IX is being weaponized in a particular way, it makes me remember that the Kaplan report is one way to think about these tangible, for some folks, they need to see the actual numbers. That's the only way they will understand it. So I think the Kaplan report is really important to think about for folks that care about the economic side, there's money on the table when we don't offer these same opportunities, resources for women's basketball, for example. There's a way that we can think about how those folks might be swayed by $100 million being on the table, right? For me, I'm interested in how broadcast rights, for example, perpetuate inequity. And I think the Kaplan report did a great job of talking about how the Turner deal, the idea of having to buy into that on the men's side and then having to pay on the ESPN side for women's basketball is deterrent for brands, corporate sponsors that might be investing, right? So there's all these different ways at the various sites. It's kind of very much this separate and also not equal treatment is happening. I think is so important to think about. And for some people, they can only understand it through a PDF, right? For me, I do my research by interviewing and sitting with athletes and watching them and trying to understand how they understand their worlds. And for me, that's really effective, right? So for some folks, they want the narrative of what it's like to be a college athlete in 2021. And I think no matter what we go to, whether we're going historically and thinking about, for example, Cheryl Miller, one of my heroes, right? In the 80s is going in front of Congress and saying, hey, I just won a gold medal. I just did my thing at USC, and yet I'm still here in front of you asking you for these protections. And so I think this idea of Title IX is this unstable thing. The Kaplan report shows us how far we've come and how far we have to go, right? And so for me, I constantly try to think about how it's something we will have to continually fight for now and in the future.
And Simone, Courtney mentioned, the financial aspects of this, and I wanted to read part of an email that you sent to me and to the group as we were preparing for this. From your perspective as a professional soccer player, and you said what we need is equal investment in women's sports, not just equal access. Without the same marketing, advertising, and resources as male counterparts, women's sports aren't given the same opportunity to generate the fan base and the revenue that male sports can. This perpetuates the cycle of not investing in women's sports for lack of revenue reasons. I continue to see this play out in my professional sports world daily. And so I wondered if you could share some examples of how you see it play out.
Yeah. So I think kind of going back on what I was saying, I feel like the next step in the unfinished business part of Title IX is that equal investment part, because I think Title IX is so important in that it can be a blueprint for professional sports, in that if we properly invest in women's sports, we market them, we put them on TV, advertise them, and draw that audience, then that would encourage media and broadcasting rights and all of that to invest in women's sports on the professional level. Because I feel like that's something that it ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, or just an ongoing cycle where we're not putting women's sports on TV. So then we don't develop the same fan base and support. So then people use that as an excuse, like, oh, well, you guys don't have a fan base, so why would we put you on TV? And it's like, you never gave us a chance in the first place. So you have to be able to make that initial investment before you're able to reap the benefits. And I think that you see that play out, like I said, in my day-to-day life. I think, for example, our championship game this year is shown at 9 a.m. And please tell me the last time the NBA finals were played at 9 a.m. Literally never, because if you want people watching it, you're going to put it at 7 p.m. You're going to put it on prime time. You're going to put it when people are going to be around the television watching TV. But for us, it's like, oh, well, we don't know if people want to watch it, so we're going to give you just any old time slot. Or I think of even things like playing surfaces. In soccer, playing on grass is premium surface. It's the safest surface to play on. It's the best, basically. And whereas like for us in our league, we have a turf field. Like there's a team with a turf field. There's 2 teams that are playing on converted baseball fields. Our 2015 the 2015 Women's World Cup was played on an all the fields were turf, and like the accumulation of like those little things, it just like adds into, like I said, that cycle of just not investing in women's sports and not putting in that initial investment that you can see the growth that you would need to see. And so I think just a lot of an accumulation of those small struggles are, it adds, and it's what leads to just this overall umbrella of women's sports not having the same treatment and not being able to produce the same results that their male counterparts can.
Mm-hmm. And that leads to an issue that Victoria brought up in terms of you called it the exportability of Title IX. So Title IX, addressed at educational institutions, but these disparities and issues involving women's sports are beyond, schools. And Victoria, I wondered if you could share some of your thoughts on how these same issues are affecting and playing out in professional leagues here in America. And also you mentioned some examples in Europe as well. And then we'll take a quick break.
Sure. Well, I think just addressing the conversation and then shifting over to the exportability of Title IX, I think women in college sports and Title IX as kind of the stand-in for that serves as a frustrating reminder for the NCAA and member institutions, because it exposes the tension at the heart of college sports. Right, that this is educational and in service of students, and that is the core of the mission: serving students sporting opportunities and educational experiences, but that it's also a multi-billion-dollar sports entertainment enterprise organized around American college football. So that is the problem piece here, is that soccer football evolved into American football on college campuses, and a sports entertainment enterprise developed up around it. And that's the NCAA is created because of regulating college football. And so Title IX in context, and specifically this context of the tension at the heart of college sports, is really where Title IX exposes that tension, because you're kind of getting away with having it both ways, calling it educational, but then running it ruthlessly like a business when it comes to men's sports. And then when women are saying we have a gender equity and education law that requires you to provide equal opportunity for us because this is sports in schools, it exposes that tension at the core. And that's, the exceptional status of American college sports is what makes this something unique in the world, and inspirational and aspirational for so many other places. That we have elite sport development in schools, that we have resources for that we call it educational, and therefore, because of our body of civil rights laws, including education and gender and education, specifically with Title IX, that creates a recipe for really exciting things and a kind of a template and a blueprint for what it looks like to put law into practice, as Courtney was saying. And so we have, although sport was an afterthought when people were, debating this bill on the floor of Congress, sport became the place of most egregious disparities and the place where Hugh had to spend the most time putting law into practice. So the quantitative and the qualitative experiences of equal opportunity, we have people who thought about what that looks like in practice and wrote out a body of regulations and policy interpretations to help schools try to do that. And so you have people on the ground, on college campuses, in high schools too, who are trying to implement these regulations and provide the qualitative and quantitative experience of equal opportunity. So participation opportunities is typically where we look at the numbers. There's nothing about Title IX that requires equal spending, but comparable experiences from that spending. The only place where the money has to be in ratio is scholarship amounts in college sports. But the qualitative experience is where I get really excited, because we had people list out what's called the laundry list of what it feels like to be cared about, what it feels like to matter, and to have equitable treatment when it comes to promotions and publicity, locker room access, practice fields, competitive fields, like Simone was saying, like we're still having issues with that. Equipment, access to medical treatment, coaching, travel. And we see elements of this now in places beyond American school sports. The WNBA's collective bargaining agreement, like there's a listing of what people caring about your experiences as a working person are written out, like things like no longer having to have roommates when you're on the road and staying in hotels, and not having to fly commercial all the time anymore. As someone was saying, these things kind of add up, and it's not necessarily that there's one act that makes you feel like you're an inferior athlete, but the kind of collective experience of all these digs and things that are reminding you that you don't matter as much as the men do, or you don't matter at all, really matters. We saw this with the U.S. Women's National Team's gender discrimination lawsuit too. It's not just equal pay, it's this equal experience as well. And then finally, there are places outside of the U.S. who look to Title IX and the regulations in particular as inspiration and aspiration. We have a number of European football clubs who are thinking and taking seriously the qualitative experience of equal opportunity. Lewis Football Club and Maggie Murphy, who's there, has equal pay for her men's and women's soccer teams. And, soccer outside the US is the manly sport. So this would be as if an NFL team decided it was going to start a women's team and pay them equally. That's our manly sport. And then we have places like Manchester City Football Club, so a Premier League, like best in the world club that's taking seriously what its female members are experiencing, what they have access to within the facility, and not putting them in a subordinate or secondary role. So, and then the PE part, there are schools around the world where when people hear that boys and girls are playing sports together, hey, we could do that too. This is really where Title IX makes us less exceptional in the world, as long as we're sharing the knowledge that we have.
All right. Well, thank you. And this is a fascinating conversation. I know we're going to take a quick break now. We'll be back in a few minutes to continue this conversation with Simone, Victoria, Christy, and Courtney.
We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make Cap Times Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and EPIC. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.
Okay, welcome back, everybody, to our discussion on Title IX and the legacy of Title IX. Fantastic discussion with our four guests. Christy, I'll get started with you with this question. It seems like in the women's rights movement, beyond sports, there's always been sort of a tension or debate between fighting for a bigger piece of the pie or just declaring that the pie itself is rotten. What we need to do is start over with a new model. And I know that you're involved with a group called the Sporting Justice Collective that is looking at so many issues across the sports world and how they affect social justice and just our society at large. And I was curious if you could share some of the those issues that you are exploring, and in which cases, are you thinking that, it's not just a matter of divvying up the pie differently, but essentially really starting over and looking at a new way of doing things?
Sure. Yeah. So whenever we're talking about big issues like gender inequity in sport, it really requires all hands on deck. It's about collaboration. It's about cooperative efforts to really make this thing happen. And the Sporting Justice Collective, I have to give a big shout out to my friend and colleague, Dr. Anthony Weems. He is the founder of the collective, and it's been a joy working with them so far. what we really discovered in early conversations was along really anything when you're talking about social issues in sport, whether it be gender or race, so on and so forth, there's so much great work going on in so many different areas, but a lot of these efforts are siloed. Yes, there may be informal networks and collaborations taking place, but the collective really emerged to help to kind of bridge the gap, to connect some of those scholars and practitioners, athletes and activists to kind of find new ways to reimagine solutions and to address these issues. So for example, one of our latest partnerships is with the Anti-Racist Soccer Club, and they do really great work kind of developing action plans, accountability, and anti-racist initiatives within communities. So any club, league, or organization can apply to be a part of the Anti-Racist Soccer Club, and it relies on a 10-point plan that kind of says, okay, how do you do more than just the sport, right? What kind of impacts will you have in the community? How can you educate your community on anti-racist practices? And not only has that produced some practical solutions, but we've formed new relationships with people who are actually on the ground levels experiencing these things and living this on the day-to-day. So athlete activists like Kaya McCullough, we have Hugh Roberts, Brandon Miller, and by working with these athletes, it's given us as scholars new ways to think about more relevant ways to address these solutions. And so while this, yes, is in the realm of race and racism, I would argue that similar practices could be adopted to address gender inequity in sport. And I was listening to a Tucker Center podcast with Dr. Neff Walker, and she talked about the work that still needs to be done to undo this culture of sport that is just simply unfair to women and girls. And so I think we should warn against not getting too comfortable, right? I think Simone kind of talked about what can stem from getting too comfortable in a culture that doesn't serve women. And so kind of in the spirit of the collective, and I speak now largely from a scholar's perspective, I'd like to see sport management scholars move beyond simply addressing these issues and calling them out to kind of working with others to create practical solutions that can help to undo this culture. And you don't have to be a woman to address women's issues in sport, right? So challenging everyone to say, what can I do more? And then second, I would say, is to just simply value and put some respect on the names of these women athletes who have courageously and continue to courageously share their stories and advocate for themselves when others don't advocate for them, and kind of continue to persist and resist against these structures of inequality over time. Because we know, to Victoria's point, they have been and continue to do this on the daily. So I don't know if that directly answered your question, but that is the collective and what I'd like to see come out of this.
Yeah, that's amazing. And Courtney, Christy mentioned, activism by individual athletes. And when I think about the last couple of years and professional athletes, college athletes becoming more outspoken maybe than they had been in a more recent generation, and using their platforms for change. Really, it's been women athletes at the forefront. I think the male athletes maybe get more of the media attention, but when you look at the WNBA and women's soccer players in particular, they were ahead of the men, but maybe coming from a more precarious position or more risk, to them speaking out. And I was wondering if you could talk about, how and why it was women that were out front, the effectiveness that you've seen, and the challenges that they have in expressing their views as athletes speaking out about issues in society.
Absolutely. I think that one of the things, which again, I'm not the historian in the crew, but I know that we can look at broadly history, the idea that women are doing work and men get credit for it is, across the board, industry-wise. Sport is not unique in that way. But one of the things that I've been so impressed by the WNBA, the NWSL, I've been thinking about how collective action versus the individual, how that might reshape how we think. We think about these historical figures. This person had a protest. This person did a thing. And so I think I'm always trying to check myself, even when I tell the story, about how a lot of the times these are collective actions, right? When I'm listening to Chrissy talk about working with the Sporting Justice Project, I'm thinking about a collective, like what everyone brings to the table. And so when I think about solidarity, right, it's not one person taking a knee in the WNBA, it's an entire team, right? And I see this happening in women's sports in different ways. There's a lot of ways we can talk about how various sports are raced and classed in particular ways that structure how they operate. And I think Title IX is no different, right? So I'm afraid of being overly celebratory in this year as we look back, because there's a ways that when we talk about who has this victory, what does that person look like? Who is the athlete that's able to, at the K through 12 level or at the college level, like who's able to ascend? Who do we leave behind, right? And I think Victoria's starting from that space, or even Christy talking about the ways that Title IX at 45 is celebrated differently and spoken about very differently in spaces is important. And so in my work, I really come from a space also thinking about care. I'm so glad care was brought up, because whether we're thinking about that new collective bargaining agreement that's thinking about what it's like to be a parent and a professional athlete, and thinking about a players association that says, hey, some of us are parents, some of us aren't, but what does that look like? What could care look like differently that might inspire, I don't know, other workplaces that are outside of sport, for example, when we think about parental rights in this country. And so when I'm thinking about that, I think about, in the WNBA bubble in 2020, affectionately referred to as the Wubble, I think one of the things that I was really inspired by is not just what collective action looked like for them, right? Wearing Breonna Taylor's name was not just something they did. They didn't do individual things like their male counterparts. They went to Breonna's family and asked for permission and built with them. And so I think about their work with Kimberly Crenshaw and the Say Her Name campaign. And I just think about intentionality and care, what it means to actually build with folks most impacted by what you're speaking to. And so I've just been so impressed by what care looks like. Yes, it's them protesting and wearing the Jacob Blake shirts, right? But then they had a vigil that night, right? So I think about what we see and what we don't see, right? And I think about what it might mean to build sport as a space of care, because for some folks it's a refuge for us perhaps, but there's a lot of care that is sometimes missing within these spaces. And we see the high profile stories of abuse for sure, but outside of kind of the spectacle of scandal, I think about what everyday care could look like, and how that might need to be gendered in a particular way to think about the historical legacy of sport and why women, non-binary folks might need more care in this moment. And that I think comes to also the space of resources, right? Investment. And so again, when we're constantly fighting the argument of, well, not enough people, there's fewer people that watch, or you don't deserve to get paid as much, even when you're outperforming your male counterparts, right? I think that investment piece is also part of care, right? We live under capitalism, so care takes many forms. And so I think that investment piece is so important, and we're seeing those shifts, right? But those investment pieces, those economic pieces are outside of the political realm of this one particular act. And so I think, again, this not getting comfortable is really inspiring to me to think about what we want the next generation of girls and women to experience, what it looks like when we protect trans athletes in this space. And so I think I'm looking forward to the work that we still have ahead of us, right? As scholars, as athletes, right? As activists in whatever practice that we invest in. And so I'm really challenged, right? I see it as this is our moment for us to really rein it in, do a huddle, and figure out what we need in the next 50 years in the world that we want to see, whether we're thinking about someone that is running through the woods, right? Or we're thinking about someone at the highest phases of the sport.
Simone, Courtney mentioned, capitalism and also collective action, in her answer there. And so I have two questions for you that are unrelated, but related to what Courtney was talking about. One is name, image, likeness, and the changes we're seeing in the NCAA. And it looks like some of the first real beneficiaries of that are women athletes with large social media followings, and I know for you as a professional athlete, you signed a deal with Nike this year, so it was that sponsorship aspect of being a female athlete right now. And then I wanted to ask you, what are the conversations like from a collective standpoint within your team, the teams you've played for at the college and professional level on, not the business side of sports, but the social impact that you can have as an athlete?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say first going into the name, image, and likeness, it's great to see a lot of female athletes benefiting from that. But I think the deeper question that I think about is kind of the reason why. And I think when you think about professional sports and professional female athletes, a lot of times because we're not getting paid like our male counterparts, a lot of our revenue and the things like our money making essentially comes from intentional brand building and a social media presence. And it's kind of this expectation that if you want to get paid and if you want to be able to make money, you have to build a brand and you have to be on social media and you have to try and be an influencer as a way to kind of compensate for not making that much money. And so I think it's great that we have the NIL and being able to use your name, image, and likeness and build off of that. But I also think you have to kind of think deeper as to like, why are women being a beneficiary? And it's kind of born from this idea of we're not making money, so we don't have a choice. But yeah, so I think that it's good to see, but it's also kind of shines a light on where we still have to grow. And going back to your question about just the collective part, I think for us as a team, like last year, we had our own NWSL bubble. And that was just kind of in the heart of, with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, the list goes on and on. And I think for us, it's as female athletes, it's pretty easy to kind of jump on that bandwagon of support, because I think for us, we kind of have to look inequality in the face every day. Kind of like I was talking about earlier with just the accumulation of little things, whether it's playing surfaces, salary, flights, and whether or not you're chartering or flying commercial, or you have a roommate, but they don't have roommates. And just the accumulation of that, I think it's pretty easy that when we see inequality, it's like, yeah, no, we know how that feels. So like, we got to make sure that other people aren't going through that. And so I think for us, while we were in the bubble, it was a lot of team meetings, a lot of discussions about how can we kind of make a change within our own little community. And for us, it was about wearing t-shirts before our games, but not just wearing t-shirts, but going to the media and having these hard conversations. And when the protests were going on in Portland, making sure that we're supporting the people who are protesting, providing water, providing food and things like that. And so I think for us, just like being able to give back and be that voice is kind of born out of this idea of, or just the fact that we are reminded that we're women every day. And yeah, not a day goes by within my workplace that I'm not reminded that you're a woman. And for that reason, your life looks way different than someone who's a male who does the exact same thing as you every day.
Courtney mentioned, this is a question for Victoria, but Courtney, you mentioned, who are the beneficiaries, and it's not, we haven't seen, equity in who has benefited from Title IX. Victoria, so I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned the AIAW in your first remarks, and I know back then it was all women, who were coaching. Maybe they weren't getting paid much, but the leadership positions were women. As the money has increased in women's sports, you've seen many more men, choose to become involved as a women's basketball coach, for example. Or you look at the makeup of the teams, and Simone, our old late friend David Williams, the athletic director at Vanderbilt, would often talk about looking for greater opportunities for Black women to receive scholarships, where if you have lacrosse or swimming, golf, tennis, traditional country club or wider sports, then the opportunities for all people to benefit from Title IX aren't there. So Victoria, I was wondering if you could talk about this idea of who has benefited, whether they're unintended consequences or they actually were intended from Title IX.
Yeah, thank you. I often I use my own story to talk about kind of winners and losers. There are winners and losers in college sports right now. And I consider myself to be a beneficiary of Title IX. And because of that, I feel that I hold a responsibility and a beneficiary of collegiate amateurism is the other piece. So I've benefited from Title IX, but I've also benefited from collegiate amateurism. And again, it's this tension at the core of Big Ten college sports, that these are sporting opportunities to serve students, that it's scholastic and educational. And that's become conflated over the years with amateur, since the rest of the world abandoned amateurism. And, again, this business of running football in American colleges is unique in the world. And unfortunately, for women's sporting opportunities or any efforts at gender equity in school sporting spaces, football is the problem that also needs to be addressed. And I would argue part of the problem that women can take on as well. That we hold a responsibility to also make sure that everyone in this system is in a better place. And so, because schools are unequal in the U.S. and because schools are not equally resourced in the U.S. and because we have residential segregation, and I grew up in the corridor between Milwaukee and Chicago, so I think a lot of people tuning in are familiar with that strip, and I grew up on Lake Michigan, and that corridor, Kenosha, where Jacob Blake was shot, that's the most segregated metro area in the United States. And our schools are reflective of that. So I went to a public school with ample resources and a woman athletic director who baked gender equity into everything we did in our high school sporting opportunities in the late 1990s, when colleges happened to be adding women's country club sports teams. So a disproportionately high number of girls from my high school went on to play college sports. These were girls whose parents could pay for them to go to college, but they were getting college scholarships and opportunities and doors opening because of this moment and because of the resources of their family and their school. So like lacrosse and field hockey, water polo, these were all sports that were being added for schools to prove compliance with the law in this moment. The money in college sports has accelerated, and it continues to accelerate. And that's because of football money. I mean, we're having a 50th anniversary of Title IX at the same time that we're having a constitutional convention by the NCAA, all these antitrust challenges, which are now successful in the Supreme Court, that this is professional sports, that amateurism is an antitrust practice to cap the amount of money that athletes in professional sports receive. And so the conversation around the future of women's college sports, Courtney was talking about how Title IX is unstable. It's going to become a lot more unstable, and we need to be proactively thinking about the value of sports in schools for women and how to subsidize the value of sports in schools for women, because the money has been transferring from football players who are disproportionately Black at predominantly white institutions to beneficiaries like me, which are more often to be young women from schools with resources and families with resources. So we can't have a conversation about Title IX in a kind of reflective anniversary year that's also thinking to the future without also thinking about making sure football players get what they deserve, and then figuring out how to sell what we do and the value of what we do in schools and make sure it's subsidized and protected and growing from that point too.
Fascinating. Courtney, I think you wanted to hop onto that question.
Yeah, I think this is a really important piece for sure. And even when you talked about how schools are segregated, right? So when we talk about like how race and class from the K through 12 level, we go through these experiences. I'm thinking about how there's a way that youth sports, right? How sports even operate because of all the money that you're talking about, right? So these kids are professionalized so young. Like college sports, it's like we can't even have, that's like been over, right? But when these kids specialize so early, there's a way that folks are talking about not only the overuse injuries that are happening, right? We talked about our childhoods of like playing all these sports and then finding our thing is very different than kids who are having Tommy John surgery by the time they're in high school, right? And so I think there's a way that the professionalization of youth sports has done a lot, obviously psychologically, to kids. If you go to any, like, parents are terrifying to me when I go to youth sport events, because there's a way that this is all baked into these things, right? These things don't happen in isolation. We can't talk about redlining without also talking about how it affects all these spaces. We can't talk about sexual assault on campus while understanding how Title IX is constantly in flux, right? And so I think there's all these connective pieces that matter that tell us how we move. I think that's why we all love sport. In a way, it allows us to see the rest of the world in a very vivid way, right? The body is on full display. And so I think one of the things that I'm really nervous about, right, in all of these spaces, whether we're talking about NIL or they're talking about youth sports or talking about sports in schools, right, or the resources we give to education at this point in the game anyway, I think one of the things that for me is terrifying to think about as we constantly fight for Title IX, I think that there's a way that I am seeing how this idea of, like, we're done, right? Someone bought this, I think there's a way that people say, like, well, that's already happened, right? And so now we're just kind of living with, oh, well, yeah, women can play college sports, or Sabrina's jersey is selling out, or there's ways that we celebrate these small victories, right? Without understanding these structural things haven't shifted as much as we might have liked in 50 years. And so the unintended consequences that I think that are more difficult to talk about are not only who's left behind, but thinking about, like, those leadership opportunities. When you talk about when there were, the AIAW, like, thinking about the times where there were women's ADs, right? Where there was a men's AD and a women's AD, right? And thinking about what the consolidation, it's just weird how all the ADs ended up just being men, right? So all the consolidation of having these resources, of having folks in departments that were looking out for women's sports at the college level, the folks that were invested, and now we look at the coaching ranks. Has Title IX increased those coaching opportunities for women as they're now higher paid positions? Are we allowing athletes to go into these coaching pipelines at the same rate as their male counterparts? And so I think when I look forward, I'm thinking about how are we creating opportunities for more women to be in the front offices of women's sports teams, to be coaches, to be in leadership positions on the admin level, athletic departments at the college level. So I am so nervous sometimes as I see women's sports become more popular, it's fantastic. But then when I see the people who are profiting and benefiting from it, I'm really still left saying, like, where are we? How do we continue to kind of shake the table in a way where there's more opportunities, especially when it comes to coaching, ownership, leadership? Because I think that is how we change how the sport looks and feels and how athletes feel as they're moving through it. I want a lot more former women's athletes coaching and making the decisions for teams and being in rooms when broadcast rights are being discussed, right? Because I think that we know how to do it. And I think that we also have that experience, whether embodied or not, to really go in and make the change we want to see. And as long as men are still controlling the cards in that way and deciding who's programming and what time the final is going to be, right? I think that's so important. The people that program these events, right? The people that decide what time they air, the people that are organizing, the people that work at Nike and Adidas, all these things matter. And I think sometimes I think feels overwhelming sometimes to think about the structures that are still in place, right? While also patting themselves on the back for, like, look, we gave you this team, like, that should be enough. We're done.
Right. Hey, you opened the door for me to give a shout out to my boss also, who is Dr. Candace Lee, who is the athletic director here at Vanderbilt, African-American woman, former basketball player here at Vandy, and feel so fortunate to work for Candace. We're coming up against our time. Christy, I wanted to ask you a question about mental health. Topic being discussed across, more than just sports, but this past year with some high profile stories involving Simone Biles, Naomi Osaka. What are the mental health issues facing women in sports, particularly women of color in sports, and what can we learn from that?
Oh, I'll start by saying that I have been extremely moved and empowered by these stories. I'm so glad that it's becoming a part of the mainstream. I know that I am not too far, but somewhat far removed from being an athlete myself. And it's scary having conversations with former teammates of mine when we talk about, we knew at the time that we were going through some things, but we didn't necessarily have the words to put behind them to describe what we were feeling, that they were most likely probably real mental health issues, but they weren't part of the conversation back then. So you didn't really have a choice but to tough it out, right? But it's so great to see those narratives being challenged by some of these very highly recognized athletes, Simone Biles, Naomi Osaka, because those narratives and that mentality is something that we're socialized to think, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And so I think it carries weight just by providing the language to describe these things. I love to see other resources coming from other spaces. I was moved by Kate Fagan's book, What Made Maddie Run, a few years back. Just seeing so many overlaps, and mental health is something that affects so many people, especially now. So the vulnerability in those athletes sharing their stories and being willing to step away from competition on top of that, at some of the top tier levels of sport, I think the solidarity behind that, and there's not just one, there's many, which is positive in that there is power in numbers, but a negative in that this is a real issue that's affecting a lot of people. And so what I think I would love to see is mental health not only being heard, but providing resources to address that, just as we would treat athletic training and taking care of the physical side of the athlete, and nutrition and dietitians and providing that nutritional advice, right? Also following that and saying, not only do we hear you, but we support you. And I hope that this is something that continues to remain part of the narrative here moving forward. And I think as far as just most simply putting it, these humans are more than athletes, right? These are people with real lived experiences on and off the field of play, and we should treat them as such. So that's the last thing I would add.
All right. Well, this has been a terrific conversation. Just to wrap things up, real rapid fire, want to ask each of you to give us all a suggestion of a human, as Christy mentioned, who, whether for reasons on or off the field, is someone that you really admire right now, that you would recommend that our audience keep an eye on. Simone, I'll start with you. Maybe there's someone in your league or someone that you really admire across the sports world.
That's a hard one. I feel like there's so many athletes doing amazing things. I would say I really admire Crystal Dunn, female soccer player who's killing it because I admire her because I feel like she's someone outside of obviously her prowess on the field, but someone who has stepped up and just knows her worth. She's a Black female soccer player in a predominantly white sport. And for her recently, with all the success she's had, even with her success, she hasn't gotten the clout and the popularity as a lot of her white female counterparts. And so recently she's kind of stepped up and spoken up about just what she brings to the table and has acknowledged her worth publicly. And that's something that I really appreciate and I really respect. And so definitely Crystal Dunn.
Oh, fantastic. How about you, Courtney?
Okay, so I was trying to narrow it down to one. I'm gonna have to do a little co-award here. One of them has to be Allison Felix, who I finally got to see run in person recently at the Prefontaine Classic. And I think both on and off of the track, Allison Felix has just been this mainstay in my life, in my excitement. I love track and field. And I think thinking about what motherhood looks like for different people, especially for professional athletes, what sponsorship, what branding looks like, what resilience looks like, what this idea of knowing your worth. Absolutely. I think that Allison Felix is just, for me, like a superhero. And my other one has to be Nneka Ogwumike. I adore Nneka. And I think for me, as someone that studies labor, thinking about someone being the president of a players association, having incredible seasons and just having this way that there's mentorship. I think her leadership both on and off the court, watching her and doing research and just following NECA around, I've been so impressed by her. All the Ogumukes, actually. I can't imagine being part of such a talented family, but I think that NECA to me is what the future of sport looks like in terms of leadership that can both drive social justice forward and be at the forefront of a league, of getting a league 99%, 100% vaccinated. I just think that I don't know when she sleeps, but I am just so impressed. That's got to be one of my faves as well.
Oh, those are two great ones. Victoria.
I'm going to cheat and do two as well, but only because one is a Wisconsin connection. So I feel like that gives me a pass. Molly Seidel, who earned the bronze in the marathon in Tokyo, is a Wisconsin runner. And Molly, for me, she is the athlete who is very exciting to follow right now because she found her power and her joy. And when she was coming down toward the finish line, knowing she was going to be an Olympic medalist, she roared. And to watch Molly roar while she was finishing that race, I think is just such a great capturing of someone who's reclaimed her running and her life in a really positive way. And then the other athlete, another track and field person, that's my bias, is Anna Cockrell, the USC hurdler who just finished her collegiate eligibility. She became only the second person in history to win double gold in the 100 hurdles and the 400 hurdles at the NCAA. And then she made the hardest team to make in the women's 400 meter hurdles, considering her two American compatriots have been like pushing each other to world records. And Anna is amazing because she's also taken on an incredible job of using her story to help others with regard to mental health. She speaks openly and honestly and powerfully about that. And then I also would hire her. If I worked in the Pac-12, I'd hire her today to get to work fixing college sports from a conference level out and have everyone follow us in the Pac-12. Athletes do exit interviews. And Anna said, no, thanks, I'm not doing an exit interview, like a quick survey. She made a meeting with the athletic director at USC and presented like a 20-slide PowerPoint deck about all her ideas to make athletics better. And she's just very thoughtful and a wonderful, excellent athlete and human.
That's great. And we'll wrap up with you, Christy.
All right. I will say, Courtney, I just picked up a new pair of Allison Felix's shoes. She just came out with her new line. They just came in the mail, so I'm very excited about that. But I would have to go with Naomi Osaka. I know I just spoke on her efforts with mental health. I think just her humility, how she is not always one of many words, but her words are effective, and how she leads with her actions is something that really inspires me, and showing that there's a lot of different ways to go about voicing your message and activist efforts. How she seamlessly stepped into this activist role despite being fairly young. And I'm really looking forward to the fact that she's just getting started, and can't wait to see all the amazing things that she continues to do in that space.
All right. Well, I just wanted to say thank you again to each of you for taking the time to participate in this discussion. I know everyone learned so much. I imagine that everyone watching will want to continue to follow you. So I wanted to give everybody's Twitter handles real quick so that you can follow each of these speakers. Simone Charlie's is easy. It's her name, Simone Charlie, at Simone Charlie. Courtney Cox is at Court M Cox. Victoria, History Runner, at History Runner. And then Christy is Christy_Oshiro. So again, thank you to each of the speakers. Thank you to the Idea Fest for putting on this panel, and hope to be speaking with all of you again soon. Take care.
We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make Cap Times Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey and Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and EPIC. Our Friends of IdeaFest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making IdeaFest 2021 a huge success.